All right. So this is how Web2Cit translation system works. This is gonna continue being like this unless except very small changes that like the one that I have just mentioned. But now it comes to how we adjust translation. Like this is how we define templates, how we define patterns. In the near future, we will have the visual editor to do this. But right now, we don't have this ready. So to manually tweak this, we have to change the configuration files. And this is what the rest of the presentation is going to be about. So sorry, I was speaking without reading the notes. These templates, patterns, and tests will be defined. The tests, I haven't talked about them yet. Don't worry, I will mention them in the future in just a moment. They will be defined using the editor, but until we have them ready, we can start experimenting, manually editing some configuration files. And this is what we will do right now. So where are these files stored at? How can we go and edit them? They are stored here at Meta, specifically in this subdirectory, Web2Cit/data. And for each domain, so for example, we imagine we have www.example.com. The path for the configuration files are in the inverse order. So com goes first, then /example goes second, then /www goes at the end. Okay, so if we had, instead of this domain, we had sub.www.example.com, then we would have to add a sub at the end of the path. Okay, so it goes from the top hierarchy to the lowest hierarchy. That's the path from left to right. And then we said that we had three possible configurations: the templates, the patterns, and the tests, which we hadn't talked about. I promise I will talk about it later. So for the templates, we go to templates.json. For the patterns, we go to patterns.json. Okay, and be aware that if you change these configuration files, you will be changing Web2Cit translation for all Web2Cit users. So whenever you change this, be aware of this, that if you want to maybe experiment, we will discuss later on how we plan experimentation, but for the moment, just be aware of this. If you change these files, translation will change not only for you, but for all users of Web2Cit. And let's see then how these files are written. Sorry, this was a little disorganized. Is this clear?
I mean, clear for whom? I mean, I'm not a technical person, but I think it's more or less clear.
Okay.
I do have one question about the previous slide. So
this one?
Yeah. So the idea is when you say up to 3 configuration files per domain and share among all Web2Cit users. So now I'm a little bit confused, and maybe it's not for this video to solve, but basically you could have like example, and let's say you had example 2, right? So example and example 2 would be sharing the same JSON files, the same configuration files?
Like a separate domain?
Yeah, like a separate domain.
No.
Okay.
The configuration files for example.com are going to be separate from those from example2.com. What I meant with shared among all Web2Cit users is that if you change configuration for example.com, then the translation is, for example.com specifically, is going to be affected for all users trying to translate an example.com web page using Web2Cit. It's not that you just...
No, go ahead, sorry.
It's not that you just, if you edit the files, it's not that you're just editing how Web2Cit is going to work for you. You're going to change how Web2Cit is going to work for everyone, but just for the specific domain you're working on.
So let's say I'm a user that feels a little bit intimidated by this fact that you might change everything for everyone. Can you still go ahead and create like example 3 and recreate these files and change the templates, patterns, tests, whatever you want to change, and that way you make sure you're not changing it for the examples that are currently working. Does it make
yes,
question?
you might do it, but because you're defining that for example 3, then that's only going to work for web pages in example 3, and maybe I'm not sure if that web page actually exists. We're going to discuss a proposal that we are currently working on to have a sandbox where you can like write these files on your meta subpage, user subpage, and force Web2Cit to use that until you found something that is working, and then and only then move it to like the main space. But let me do this in the end. For the moment, just know this, but also like that's like a downside until we have the visual editor. But as an upside, not so many users are going to be using Web2Cit translation, so that if you break it right now, it's not going to be breaking for so many people. We are still testing.
Be bold. Sorry? Be bold. Be bold.
That's exactly. Be bold. Be bold. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what we want at this stage. So these files are written in JSON format. And because some of you might not be familiar with JSON format, just very briefly, our files have 4 value types inside these JSON formats. You can have strings. Strings are like this one. They are between double quotation marks. So this is an example string value. You can have booleans, which are either true or false. These are the 2 Boolean value types possible. You can have arrays or lists, which is the same. And an array in JSON is defined between square brackets, and inside a square bracket, 2 square brackets, you have the series of values of that array. So we have value 1, comma, value 2, comma, as many values as you want, value n. An array is delimited by a couple of square brackets. And you may also have objects. And an object is a pair, a series of pairs of keys and values. So you have key 1, also between double quotation marks, colon, the value for that key. And again, this value can be any of the values supported. It can be a string, it can be a Boolean, it can be an array, or it can be another object. And in this case, we have key 1, value 1, key 2, value 2, key n, value n, between curly braces, okay? This is generally how a JSON file is structured. And because we are going to be working with the Wikipedia, with the meta editor for this, you may want, this is not mandatory, but it's helpful, if you wrap your JSON content within these tags, there's a syntax highlight lang JSON in the beginning and this closure tag at the end, then the editor is going to format it nicely so that it can work with it better. Now, having said this, the Wikipedia editor, in this case the meta editor, are not made for editing JSON files. So definitely I would suggest, if you're going to be working with JSON files, you can use a separate editor, work on the JSON files in the separate editor, and then paste the result to meta. That's going to be much, much more helpful, unless you want to make just some minor tweaks. But if you're going to be actually editing this, do not do it in meta, because it's impossible. I mean, it's very difficult to do it there. I'm gonna go back to this because we have alternatives so that you don't have to deal with JSON format, which is not like the most friendly format. But let me show how this is structured in JSON before I show the alternatives. I think it's going to be easier. So again, we said we had, sorry, yes. Okay, so specifically for, let's start with one of the files, which is the most complex one, which is templates.json. Going back to what we said before, remember that for a domain, we can have one or more templates. That's what we said at the beginning. How does this translate to a JSON file? So in the JSON file, you will find an array. That's why we have these square brackets at the beginning and at the end of template objects. So we have template 1, which is one template object, template 2, template n. This is just a placeholder because I wanted to make this simpler to explain it. But this template object actually looks different. Let's see how a template object looks like. This is a template object. So it's one of these examples. Template 1 should be replaced by a template object, which looks like this. The template object has 3 properties, that is 3 key value pairs. The first one is the path. Remember that we said that a template was a specific example web page for which we have indicated precise instructions of how that web page should be translated. So the path property indicates the path to this specific web page. Yeah, so in this case, if we were working in example.com and we are defining a template for /article1, then path would be /article1. It's the path to the web page we're using as a template. You don't have to include here the domain. The domain is already included in the path to the configuration file. Here, you just include the path. And more information you can find in the guidelines. This path, you can include fragments, which are represented with a hash character. You can also include query strings, which are represented with a question mark. Those details, you can find them in the guidelines. The second property is the label of the template. This property is optional. You're not required to use it. But if you want to give a template a fancy name, this is the place to write the fancy name. Like, let's say that, for example, you have 2 kinds of web page. You have news web pages and you have event web pages. Here you can say event. You can say here news. You can give it a name that helps you remember why you are defining a separate template for that kind of web pages. The third property is the fields property. And the value of the fields property is an array, a list of template fields. I'm just like what we said before we said that a template had a series of fields. We are just translating this into a JSON file. So let's go and see how a template field looks like. The next slide. This is a template field object. The template field object has a field name. Remember that we supported 9 field names so far: item type, title, author name, author first, author last, and so on. So this is the field name. Again, in the guidelines, you can find which field names we support. This is where we tell Web2Cit if this is a required or a not required field. If we want it required, we set this to true. If we don't want it required, we set this to false. And the field has a series of procedures. Remember from our previous slides, this was the figure that we used for that. So the procedures property is an array of procedure objects. Procedure 1, 2, n. If we can have 1, we can have more. This is how a procedure looks like, a procedure object. The procedure object has 2 properties: selections and transformations. Remember from our previous slides, a procedure was a series of selections, the output of which we passed to a series of transformations. This is where we define how these selections and transformations look like. So we have a series of selections that is an array of selection objects, and a series of transformations that is an array of transformation objects. Let's see how these objects look like. This is a selection object. The selection object has 2 properties. The type of selection, in the guidelines, again, I'm going to switch to that tab, but if you go to the guidelines, there is a section that is selection types and configurations. Here you can see the different selection types that we currently support and how to configure these selection steps. So we're not going to go into detail in this presentation, but you can read these guidelines to see how to configure these selection steps and which selection steps you can use. But back to the presentation, here we have a selection object. It has two properties: type, where you define what selection step you want to use. We currently support XPath, fixed, and cytoid, and the configuration of the step. So depending on the type, the configuration format is different. So if, for example, if you're using selection type XPath, the configuration is going to be the XPath expression that points to the HTML node that you want to select. If the selection type is cytoid, then the configuration is going to be the field of the cytoid response that you want to select. If the selection step is fixed, then the configuration is the fixed value that you want the selection step to always return. Okay? And for the transformation objects, they're very similar to the selection objects. So you have a type. Remember that we currently support a limited set of transformation types. We mentioned some minutes ago the split transformation. We mentioned the date transformation. And these transformations have to be configured. So for example, for the split type, the configuration is what the limiter we will use to split the string into two substrings. Or if it is the date transformation, then the configuration is going to say which locale we're using to try to transform the natural language date into a formatted date. So if we are working with the Spanish web page, then the configuration is going to be ES for Spanish. But if we're working with an English web page, then we're using EN. All of this, again, we're not going to go into detail, but if you go to the early adopters guideline, to the transformation types and configuration section, you will find all the transformation steps that we currently support and how to use them. So for example, for the date transformation, you have an explanation here. You have what you have to write in the type field. So this date here is saying what I have to write here in a transformation object to use the date transformation step. And here are the possible configuration values. So again, if we want to use Spanish for locale, then this is the value that I have to write in the configuration value of the transformation step. And finally, the field that is extra in the transformation step, which was not available in the selection step, is this item-wise property. Mainly and very briefly, because as we plan to, sorry, let me go full screen again. We plan to make this optional. You can read more about this in this fabricator task down here. The item-wise configuration simply says, if you want to apply this transformation to the whole input as a whole, to the input of, sorry, let me be clearer. We have here these selections here, which output something that is the input for the transformation step. This thing that the selection output is actually a list of values. The item-wise property just says, if I want to apply the transformation item per item, or if I want to apply it to the array as a whole. Let's give an example. Let's say that the output of the selection is a list of two values, A and B. If I set transformation item-wise true, then I'm going to apply transformation to A first and transformation to B second. But if I set this to false, then I'm going to use the array as a whole and apply the transformation to the whole array. I'm sorry I'm going into this detail. Please read more about it in the guidelines. Usually you want item-wise to be true, but in some cases you might want it to be false, because some transformations are to be applied on an array of objects. For example, the join transformation joins separate strings into only one. So the expected input is actually an array. And in those cases, you want item-wise to be false. But again, I'm sorry for the excessive details. As a rule of thumb, always use item-wise true. If you need some specific configuration, you can change this, read the guidelines. But anyway, in the future, and this is task 303.331, this is gonna be optional. If you don't set this, then a default value is gonna be used. But like, again, as a rule of thumb, use item-wise true, except for some specific cases. And in the near future, you won't need this if you don't know what this is.
Yeah, and also
Okay.
if you don't understand the difference and you're not sure and you want to get confirmation, also contact Diego to his user page on Meta, right? I would say that's like also a good rule of thumb for like solving some of these problems.
Okay, thanks. And sorry for that level. I prepared these slides just a few minutes ago. I should have made that differently. Sorry for the excessive details.
No. Like you have been preparing this for the last 4 months.
Yeah, that's true.
This on the last minute. We're like pros.
But not the explanation. Not the explanation. Now, when it comes, that was for the templates JSON file. We have patterns JSON file. That's much easier. And anyway, as we said before, in most cases, you won't need to configure patterns. But very briefly, patterns JSON is a list of pattern objects, and each pattern object has two properties. One property that defines the URL path pattern that you want to match. And for this, you will use something that is called glob patterns. For those of you who are familiar with shell scripting, who are familiar with using the terminal, that's what you do when you want to list a series of files that match a pattern. That's where you use asterisks. But if you want to find more about it, just go to the guidelines and you will find useful links to learn more about glob patterns. And the same way we did with templates, you can also give a pattern a fancy name if you want. You can give it a label. This property is optional, but just as we did with templates, you can use this field to help you remember why you are defining separate patterns for a specific domain. And last but not least, the third configuration file, for which I haven't said anything so far, is the tests configuration file. I'm not going to go into detail with this because this is not yet ready in the Web2Cit ecosystem, but this has to do with what we will do to monitor that Web2Cit translation is working correctly. So this file is made so that you can say for specific web pages what is the expected translation output. You're not defining any translation procedures for this. You don't know how to get the information from the web page yet, or maybe you don't care. You just say, for this web page, this is the output that should be returned. So in the future, when we have this ready, there's going to be a script that is going to be crawling these test JSON files and making sure that Web2Cit translation is returning the goals that have been defined, the expected goals. But this is not yet ready. Just very briefly, because this video is going to be used in the future. This is a series of test objects, and each test object has a path to the web page for which you're going to define translation goals and a list of goals. And each goal is for this item type. This is not, this is a mistake. This is not an array of goals. This is just a single goal. And the goal is for a given field name, this is the output I want. For another field name, this is the output I want, and so on for all the field names that you want to define a goal output. We're gonna go back to this when this has been implemented. Just know that Web2Cit has a configuration file that is called tests.json, where you can define the translation goals for any number of web pages for a specific domain. And this is going to help us not only monitor translation, but it's also going to help us write translation templates. We're going to see this in just a second. So, and now we're going to get a little bit more practical. How to edit these configuration files. Let me share with you some resources that I think are going to help you do this. First of all, you will have example files. So if you go to the guidelines and you go, for example, to the templates.json section of the guidelines, the first two things you'll find, actually the first thing you'll find is an example file. An example file, but if you open it, you're gonna get an example template. This is for a specific domain, which is a real domain, and this is not a good template actually, because it's not working as expected, but it has the correct format. So if you want to write a template for a separate web page and you don't know where to begin, just go to edit this file and copy the content to the new file that you're creating. So this is one resource, an example template that you might use. You also have the same thing for patterns and for tests. The second thing is a validation schema. Validation schemas are documents that say to a computer how a JSON file has to be written so that the JSON file is correct. We have made available JSON schemas for all configuration files. You have one for templates JSON, but you also have one for patterns JSON and for test JSON. If you open this file, you will get this raw text here. How do we use this? You also have this explained in the guidelines, but briefly, you can use a JSON schema validator. You can find this in the slides anyway. We can use this validator. This is a list of validators available. You can use one in your text editor, but you can also use one online. This is the one I'm gonna use right now just to show you. So very briefly, again, you can find more details in the guideline. If you paste the schema to the left side of this validator, and you start writing a JSON in the right field, then this is gonna tell you if the JSON has the correct format or not. So for example, the templates JSON is expecting an array as a top level element because the templates JSON is a list of templates. So if we give it an empty array, then the format is correct. But remember that the template object has a path property, which should have a string. It has a label property that is optional, but it also has a fields object. And we're not including the fields object in this template object. And this validator is gonna warn us about this. Right here it says the required property is missing from an object. You're missing a fields object, okay? So this schema using a validator will help you find errors in the JSON files you're writing. And believe me, you're gonna make mistakes because writing JSON files is very difficult. They're not the most friendly format. This is why we want to have a visual editor in the future. But please use the validator before pasting your JSON to Meta, because otherwise the translation is gonna break for no reason. Just make sure that at least the format of your JSON is matching the expected format using the JSON schema. And last, and this might be maybe the most important, we can use an alternative format. I explained all of this using JSON because it's the way how this is going to be saved in Meta, but you can use an alternative proxy, which is using YAML as an alternative format. YAML is a file format that is also used for configuration files, which is way simpler than JSON. It has some downsides. They are all explained in the guidelines, but it simplifies things because, for example, you're not obliged to put strings within double quotation marks. So if you forget them, that's okay. You can use object keys without double quotation marks as well. And it is like, for those of you who might be familiar programming with Python, it is indentation based. So you don't have to remember that arrays use square brackets. You don't have to remember that objects use curly braces. You can ignore some commas. Like for example, an array in YAML is defined just like this, just a series of values with a dash as a bullet. Or an object, for example, is defined just like this, a key, colon, a value, a second key, sorry, this is not a comma, it's a colon, value, and so on. This makes that a JSON file like this one, this is an example template for written in JSON, can be written much shortly this way in YAML. So this is the same file written in YAML to the right and here in JSON to the left. And you can use online converters to convert one format into the other and back. This is the one I used, but there are many more available. So my suggestion, if you're going to be editing this, is that you follow this workflow. First of all, you will open the file that you want to edit. This file might exist already, or maybe it doesn't exist already. Maybe you're the first person, probably you're the first person writing a configuration file for a specific domain. So if you go to where the file should be located and you don't find it, you will just create a new file as you create a new Wikipedia article or a new meta page. So, but if you find something there, copy the JSON, do not include those syntax highlight tags at the beginning and the end, of course, because those are not part of the JSON syntax. Copy them to a JSON to YAML converter. This can be your first step. Now you have a YAML file, and you can edit the YAML file. That's much more easier than editing a JSON file. Once you have edited your JSON file, you can convert it back to JSON using a YAML to JSON converter. At this step, you have a JSON, and you can validate the JSON output. You can use the validator that I showed before with the JSON schema to validate your JSON file. Yeah, because of course you will not have forgotten a square bracket because the YAML to JSON converter will have taken care of that. But maybe you forgot a path property, as we showed in the example. So this validator is going to help you make sure that your final JSON is correct. And if your final JSON is following the expected format, then and only then paste the JSON in meta. Okay, so anyway, we understand that this is quite tedious, like going through all these steps to write the configuration file. We currently have this open task in Fabricator with the idea that you can write the configuration files directly in YAML so that you don't have to convert from JSON to YAML, back from YAML to JSON. We are currently deciding whether to go forward in this direction or not, because this is something that is not going to be useful once we get the visual editor. So we are seeing how much effort it is that Web2Cit currently supports YAML natively, but stay tuned and write your comments in the Fabricator task if you're interested, because we might support both JSON and YAML format natively so that you can just write your YAML files directly. That's it for how to write a configuration file. So to recap, we saw like a general description of how Web2Cit translation works. We saw how to adjust this Web2Cit translation configuration manually editing the configuration files. Let's go now to see how to use Web2Cit translation. And for this, we have the translation server. Be aware that we currently have a very initial implementation of the server, but anyway, this is quite how it is going to work in the future. We're going to have just very minor tweaks that will make it just a little bit more friendly. So to use the translation server, you will go to the translation server address, which is this part in gray, web2cit.toolforge.org, and you will append at the end of the URL that you want to use to translate with Web2Cit. So let's say that you want to translate https://www.example.com/article1. This is what you will append at the end of the translation server address. as a result of this, we're going to show this in an example in a moment, you're going to get a web page that includes the citation output. So it includes, this is what Web2Cit says for the item type. This is what Web2Cit says for the list of authors, and so on. But the interesting part of this is that not only you will get a web page, but this web page is going to include embedded metadata in a standard format. And because of that, that web page that you will get, I mean, this full URL is going to be understood by Citoid and by Zotero translators, so that you can simply digest this into Wikipedia or Zotero. So if you want to use Web2Cit in Wikipedia right now, the only thing you have to do is, instead of using the original URL that you want to cite, you prepend the translation server address, and the Wikipedia automatic citation generator is actually going to use, it's going to use a Citoid, but Citoid is going to actually use Web2Cit to translate the web page. We are planning to add some additional temporary, until we have the visual editor ready, endpoints to the translation server. Why is this? I plan to add two, a debug and a sandbox endpoint. And with this, I'm going to reply to a question that we had at the beginning. Right now, if you edit the configuration files in Meta, remember that you will be changing how Web2Cit is working for all Web2Cit users. This is what the sandbox endpoint is going to be useful for. The idea of the sandbox endpoint is that it's going to work just like the regular, sorry, I'm using the word endpoint. With endpoint, I mean it's a specific address of the translation server that we use for a specific purpose. So the idea is that we will implement a specific translation server in a way that, instead of using the official configuration file for a domain, it may use a configuration file that you tell it to use. So for example, you might actually work, instead of working on the official configuration file, the one that is shared among all users, you will be able to write this in your subpage in Meta, for example, and tell the server to use that instead. So the moment the server is returning an expected output, then and only, it's like working on the Wikipedia in your Wikipedia subspace to write a draft Wikipedia article. You write there, and then when you're happy with the result, you move it to the main space. This is the same thing. The only thing that we need this additional endpoint to tell Web2Cit, hey, for this web page, use my experimental configuration. And once you're happy with the configuration, you paste it to the main space. I have not pasted the Fabricator task where we are tracking this, but in the end, I'm going to show you how you can see all Fabricator tasks for the Web2Cit server, and you can find it there. I hope I haven't decided yet whether we are going to implement this or not, because again, this is not going to be useful when we have the visual editor, but because this is not very difficult, we will probably do it so that we can test this more freely without fearing that we might be breaking translation for everyone. And the other endpoint that we would like to add is the debug endpoint. And this is because, imagine you want to translate a web page using a configuration that you have defined, and the citation output is not what you expected. Then you might be wondering what happened. Is maybe my template does not apply, but why doesn't my template apply if I think I have done it correctly? So the debug endpoint, instead of outputting just the citation, the idea is that it will output step by step what happened. It's like, we tried this template. For this selection, we got this. For this selection, we got that. Then we apply transformation. This is what we got. And this is the output we got. This is valid. This is not valid. So that you can have a debug of what happened exactly, so that you can know why a translation didn't work as you expected. Again, we are deciding whether to do this or not, because when the visual editor is implemented, this is not going to be useful anymore. But because this should be relatively easy to implement, we will probably do it. And again, we also have a fabricator task where we are tracking this. In the end, I'm going to